There is a bottle sitting on a shelf in a 1927 bathroom in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It looks like a medicine bottle. The label is clean and professional. The man who bought it paid the equivalent of about $30, which was not nothing in 1927, and he bought it because his doctor suggested it, and his friends were taking it, and the newspaper advertisements described it as a source of atomic energy and well-being. He drank it every morning, 3 bottles a day sometimes. He felt wonderful. The bottle was called Radithor. It contained distilled water and 2 radioactive isotopes, Radium-226 and Radium-228, and it was completely legal, commercially available, and enthusiastically marketed as a health product from the mid-1920s until 1932. It was one of dozens of radium-based products available to American consumers in the first 3 decades of the 20th century. There were radium face creams, radium toothpaste, radium chocolate, radium suppositories, a device called the Revigator that you filled with water and left overnight so the radioactive ceramic lining could infuse it with the healing properties of atomic decay. This was not quackery in the shadows. This was not sold in back alleys or through whispered recommendations. It was in pharmacies. It was in department stores. It was advertised in national newspapers and endorsed, in some cases, by physicians who genuinely believed that low-level radiation exposure was beneficial to human health. The science, such as it was understood in 1925, appeared to support this view, and the science, as it turned out, was wrong in a way that took the bodies of a generation of enthusiastic consumers to fully demonstrate. Before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, only if this is something you genuinely look forward to. A sincere thank you to everyone who leaves comments and sends topic ideas. You make this channel what it is, and that is not a small thing. Drop a comment and tell me where you are and what time it is. It is always deep into someone's night, somewhere, and I find that genuinely comforting. If Spotify is where you do your drifting, the link is in the description. Now, find your position. Let the pillow take the weight of your head. Let your jaw unclench. You've been holding it tighter than you think. There is nowhere to be. But before we go back to 1920, let's sit with a few questions. Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to be handed a poison by someone you trusted completely? Your doctor, your pharmacist, the newspaper you read every morning. And not only take it willingly, but pay extra for the premium version? Have you considered what it means to live in a decade when the most exciting word in the English language was radioactive, and nobody had fully understood yet what radioactive actually did? Did the people drinking radium water know something was wrong, and if they did, how long did they keep drinking it anyway? What does it feel like to be Eben Byers, wealthy, athletic, alive with the certainty that you are doing something excellent for your health, and to be wrong about that in a way that will eventually take your jaw? What was it about the early 20th century that made Americans so willing, so eager, to consume things that glowed? And is there a version of this happening right now, today, that we cannot see yet because we are too close to it and too trusting of the people selling it? Congratulations. You've just woken up in 1927. The stock market will not crash for another 2 years. Radio is the most exciting technology anyone has ever encountered. Your doctor smokes in the examination room. Your dentist uses cocaine as an anesthetic. And the element radium, discovered by Marie Curie just 29 years ago, is understood to be a miraculous gift from the modern age, capable of curing everything from arthritis to impotence. There is a bottle of something glowing faintly on your bathroom shelf. Your physician recommended it. Your friends are taking it. The label calls it liquid sunshine. Good morning. Let's begin. To understand why a generation of Americans drank radioactive water and called it medicine, you have to understand what the word radioactive meant in 1920. It did not mean what it means now. Think about that for a moment. The same word, carrying entirely opposite connotations, separated by about 30 years of evidence. In 1920, radioactive meant alive. It meant energetic. It meant new. Radium had been isolated by Marie and Pierre Curie in 1898, and its discovery had produced a revolution in scientific thinking that the popular press translated, imperfectly but enthusiastically, into a set of beliefs about radiation that would persist well into the century. Radium glowed in the dark. It produced heat without burning. It appeared to violate the laws of energy conservation as they were then understood. It was extraordinary, and in an era that had just discovered electricity, just invented the automobile, just produced the first powered aircraft, extraordinary was easy to believe. The Curies themselves were aware that radium had biological effects. Pierre Curie had deliberately exposed his arm to radium for 10 hours and documented the burn that resulted. But the implications of this observation, that a substance capable of burning skin from the outside might also damage tissue from the inside, did not translate immediately into caution. Instead, the biological activity of radium was interpreted, by physicians and by the public, as evidence of its potency. A substance that powerful, it was reasoned, must surely be capable of doing good. This was not a stupid conclusion. It was a reasonable inference from incomplete evidence.
The problem was not that the people making it were foolish. The problem was that the evidence was incomplete in a direction they could not yet see. And between the incomplete evidence and the full picture, there was approximately a decade and a half of commercially available radioactive consumer products. Think about what that actually means.
The gap between what was known and what was true was filled, in the 1920s, not by caution but by commerce, because the products were legal, because the science appeared supportive, and because there was a great deal of money to be made. The radium health product industry did not emerge from nowhere. It had a predecessor, the patent medicine industry of the late 19th century, which had spent 40 years teaching American consumers to believe that health could be purchased in a bottle, that the right proprietary formula could cure what ailed you, and that the testimonial of a satisfied customer was sufficient evidence of a product's efficacy. Patent medicines had contained, at various points, alcohol, opium, cocaine, arsenic, and mercury. They had been sold as cures for everything from tuberculosis to female hysteria to teething pain in infants. They had been consumed with enthusiasm and without adequate information by millions of Americans who trusted the newspapers that advertised them and the pharmacists who sold them and the physicians who sometimes recommended them. By 1920, the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 had eliminated the most egregiously false claims from patent medicine advertising, but it had not eliminated the underlying consumer psychology, the deep American readiness to believe in the transformative power of the right product, the faith in technological progress, the trust in authority. Radium arrived into this psychology at exactly the right moment. It was new. It was scientific. It glowed. The Revigator arrived in American homes around 1912 and became one of the most popular radium health products of its era. It was a ceramic crock, about the size of a large water cooler, with a spigot at the bottom. The interior lining contained carnotite ore, a naturally occurring uranium-bearing mineral that also contained radium. The instructions were simple. Fill the crock with water at night, leave it to sit overnight, and dispense the energized water throughout the following day. The longer the water sat in contact with the radioactive lining, the more thoroughly it was infused with the health-giving properties of atomic energy. You would keep this crock in your kitchen or your dining room. You would fill it every evening as a matter of routine, the way you might wind a clock or set the table. In the morning, you would pour yourself a glass of Revigator water, and your children might have a glass too, and your guests would be offered some as a matter of hospitality, because the Revigator was a product of which one was proud. It was a mark of a health-conscious household. It was, in 1920, a sensible thing to own. The Revigator sold approximately 400,000 units before the evidence against radium consumption became impossible to ignore. 400,000 households keeping a radioactive water dispenser in their kitchens, dispensing measured doses of radium-infused water to their families every morning. The company that made it ran advertisements in national publications. The advertisements cited physician endorsements and described the health benefits in terms that drew directly on the scientific vocabulary of the day: ionic activity, atomic energy, vital force. The vital force argument deserves a moment because it tells you something important about what people in the 1920s believed about the relationship between energy and health. The dominant popular theory of health in this era held that the body was a kind of energy system, that illness was a deficit of vital force, and that anything capable of introducing energy into the body was therefore therapeutic. Radium, which demonstrably produced energy, which produced heat and light without being consumed in the producing, which appeared to be a kind of perpetual energy machine at the atomic level, seemed to fit this model perfectly. This was not a fringe belief held by the uneducated. The prestigious Journal of the American Medical Association published articles in the 1910s and early 1920s that described the therapeutic potential of radioactive mineral waters in terms that were cautiously positive. Spas in Europe had been advertising their naturally radioactive spring waters since the early 1900s. Physicians who practiced at these spas published case studies describing improvements in their patients' conditions. The evidence base was small, and the methodology would not survive contemporary scrutiny. But in 1920, it was the available evidence, and the available evidence pointed toward benefit. But here is where the story of radium water gets complicated in a way that is worth holding on to. The spas at Baden-Baden and Karlsbad and the other European mineral water resorts that had been treating patients with naturally radioactive spring water since the early 20th century were working with waters that contained genuinely minute quantities of radium, trace amounts, far below any level that modern radiation protection standards would consider concerning.
The waters were mildly radioactive in the way that many natural substances are mildly radioactive, and the health benefits attributed to them were at most marginal, at worst entirely placebo. What happened in America in the 1920s was different.
American manufacturers, working from the observation that radioactive water was being prescribed in Europe and that this presented a commercial opportunity, set about creating products with much higher concentrations of radioactive material. If a little was good, more was better. This was the logic of American commercial medicine in the 1920s. The logic of patent medicine, applied to the new science of atomic energy. Radithor was the product that this logic produced at its most concentrated and most lethal. It was manufactured by a company called the Bailey Radium Laboratories in New Jersey, founded and operated by a man named William Bailey, who had, it should be noted, no medical degree, no scientific credential of any kind, and a prior conviction for selling a fraudulent impotence cure. Bailey understood marketing. He understood the 1920s consumer. He understood that the words atomic energy on a product label had the same effect in 1926 that the words clinically proven have today. They activated a particular kind of trust that was not fully rational and did not require fully rational evidence. Radithor contained real radium. This was the thing that distinguished it from many of its competitors, some of which contained no radioactive material at all and were simply trading on the associations of the brand. Bailey's product was genuinely, measurably, certifiably radioactive, and he advertised this fact as a selling point. Each bottle, he claimed, contained at least 1 microcurie each of radium-226 and radium-228. He tested his own product. He was proud of its potency. The price point placed it in the upper tier of the health product market. beyond what an average working family would spend casually, but accessible to the professional class, to athletes, to businessmen, to the kind of American who read the society pages and took his health seriously, and could be relied upon to try something new if someone credible told him it was beneficial. Enter Eben Byers. Eben McBurney Byers was, in 1927, exactly the kind of person William Bailey was selling to. He was 47 years old. He was a Yale graduate, a Pittsburgh steel and iron magnate, a socialite whose name appeared regularly in the society columns of American newspapers. He had been the United States amateur golf champion in 1906. He was described by his contemporaries as vigorous, charming, and relentlessly energetic, the kind of man who seemed to have an excess of vitality that other people found both admirable and slightly exhausting. In the fall of 1927, Byers injured his arm in a fall from a railway car returning from the Harvard-Yale football game. The arm healed slowly and continued to ache. His physician, trying in good faith to help a wealthy and impatient patient who wanted to feel better, suggested he try Radithor, which was at that point among the more fashionable health products circulating in the social circles Byers inhabited. Byers tried it, and it worked. Or it seemed to work, which in this context amounts to the same thing. The arm felt better. His energy increased. He slept well. He felt, by his own account, wonderful, more alive, more vital, more himself than he had felt in years. He drank approximately 1,400 bottles of Radithor over the next 3 years. Let that number settle for a moment. 1,400 bottles, at 2 to 3 bottles a day, consistently, for 30 months. He sent cases of it to friends. He wrote letters praising it. He was, in the language of contemporary marketing, an influencer, a highly visible, highly credible consumer whose enthusiastic endorsement of the product reached directly into the social networks of exactly the people William Bailey most wanted to sell to. The radium in those 1,400 bottles was accumulating in his bones. This is what radium does in the human body. Because radium is chemically similar to calcium, the body treats it as calcium, incorporating it into bone tissue, where it sits and emits radiation continuously, at close range, directly into the surrounding tissue. It does not leave. The half-life of radium-226 is 1,600 years. Once it is in the bone, it is in the bone for longer than civilization has existed. By 1930, Byers was experiencing symptoms he could not explain and his physicians could not initially account for. He was losing weight, drastically and continuously. He was experiencing headaches of increasing severity. Holes were beginning to appear in his skull as the radiation destroyed the bone tissue from the inside. His jaw, both upper and lower, was deteriorating. By 1931, most of his jaw had to be surgically removed. He had lost so much bone tissue in his skull that his head had, by some accounts, been reduced to roughly half its original size. He was in considerable and continuous pain. He died in April 1932. He was 51 years old. The Wall Street Journal ran a headline that has become one of the most quoted in the history of medical journalism. The radium water worked fine until his jaw fell off. The Byers case was not the first evidence that radium consumption was dangerous. It was the most visible, the most extensively reported, and the most socially prominent. A wealthy, well-connected man whose deterioration was documented in the national press and whose death could not be explained away as the consequence of poverty or ignorance or the use of a substandard product. Byers had used the good stuff. He had used it as directed, in the quantities the manufacturer had implicitly encouraged, in the faith that the product was what it claimed to be. And it had killed him, slowly and painfully and in a manner that was documented in detail because he was famous enough for journalists to seek him out as his condition worsened. But before Byers, there had been the Radium girls. The women who painted the luminous dials on watches and military instruments at the United States Radium Corporation factory in Orange, New Jersey, and at similar factories in Connecticut and Illinois, had been doing their work since around 1917. The paint they used contained radium mixed with zinc sulfide, which produced the characteristic green-white glow that made the dials readable in the dark, and which had made luminous watches an extremely fashionable consumer product in the years following the First World War, when wristwatches were still relatively new, and the ability to read them at night seemed genuinely magical. The painters were taught a technique called lip pointing, to maintain the precision necessary for the small numerals and hash marks on a watch dial. The fine sable brush had to be brought to a perfect point after every few strokes. The most efficient way to do this, the women were told, was to put the tip of the brush between the lips and apply gentle suction and pressure. A lick of the brush, a fine point, and back to the dial. All day, every dial, hundreds of times per shift. They were ingesting radium with every lick of the brush. The supervisors knew the paint contained radium. The company's physicists and chemists knew the paint contained radium. The women were not told this was a concern. Some accounts describe workers being explicitly reassured that the paint was harmless. At the factory in Orange, the women were apparently told that the radium would put roses in their cheeks. This is the moment in the story where the thing that was happening becomes impossible to describe without acknowledging what it was.
The women who painted the dials were overwhelmingly young, many of them teenagers, working class, recently immigrated, or the daughters of immigrants, employed in a job that paid well by the standards of their community, and that carried a certain glamour because they went home at night with their clothes and hair faintly glowing in the dark, which their friends and families found delightful, a mark of the modern workplace.
They were being poisoned. They were being poisoned by people who had reason to suspect this was occurring, and the justification for not telling them, if there was one, which is generous, rested on the same incomplete understanding of radium's biological effects that was simultaneously fueling the consumer health product market. Radium was good for you. Radium was energy. If a little in the water was therapeutic, a little on the brush tip was surely nothing to worry about. By the early 1920s, the women were sick. The symptoms were consistent and distinctive. Anemia, bone fractures that occurred without significant trauma, necrosis of the jaw, the same deterioration of bone tissue that would, years later, be documented in Eben Byers, teeth loosening and falling out, pain that was severe and constant and could not be adequately treated with the analgesics available at the time. The company's response to these developments was to commission internal medical studies, dispute the findings of outside physicians who connected the women's conditions to their workplace, and in some documented cases, to actively suppress or manipulate the medical records of affected workers. The women were told their conditions were unrelated to their work. They were told they had syphilis, a diagnosis that carried profound social stigma and that could be used to discredit their testimony. They were told they were hysterical, but some of them fought back. And the fighting back, conducted by women who were visibly ill, who were dying, who brought their deteriorating bodies into courtrooms and depositions and newspaper offices, produced the first successful workplace radiation exposure litigation in American history. Grace Fryer, Edna Hussman, Catherine Schaub, Quinta McDonald, and Albina Larice, 5 women who had worked at the Orange factory, all of them ill, some of them dying, filed suit against the United States Radium Corporation in 1927. The case attracted national attention. It was covered in newspapers across the country. It produced the first public reckoning with what radioactive material actually did to the human body when it was introduced into that body repeatedly and in quantity. The settlement reached in 1928 gave each woman $10,000, a pension of $600 per year for as long as they lived, and the payment of their medical expenses. The settlement was modest. The women who received it were dying. Several of them died within a few years of the settlement. But the case, and the ongoing coverage of their conditions, the photographs of their deteriorating jaws, the testimony of the physicians who had examined them, did something that legal victories alone do not always accomplish. It made the harm visible. The Federal Trade Commission began investigating Radithor in 1931. William Bailey's claims about his product were examined and found to be fraudulent, not because the product was not radioactive, it was, but because the health benefits he claimed for it were without scientific foundation. The FTC ordered the product off the market in 1932, the same year Eben Byers died. By this point, the broader radium health product market was already collapsing under the weight of accumulated evidence. The Radium Girls case had been in the national press for years. The medical literature was increasingly clear that radium accumulated in bone and produced tissue destruction. The Byers case, a wealthy, prominent, socially connected man, brought the evidence to an audience that the factory workers' cases might not have fully reached. The combination was sufficient to end, within a few years, the commercial sale of radium health products in America. But here is the thing worth sitting with as you drift toward sleep. The collapse of the radium health product industry was not primarily the result of regulatory action. The FDA did not swoop in and protect consumers. The FTC's intervention came years after the harm was already extensive and well documented. The industry collapsed primarily because the evidence became impossible to ignore, because enough bodies had been damaged visibly enough, and the stories of those bodies had been told publicly enough, that the consumer psychology that had sustained the market could no longer be maintained. The regulation followed. It did not lead. What replaced the radium products, eventually, was not a cure for the underlying consumer psychology. The faith in technological progress, the readiness to believe that the right product could restore vitality and energy and health, the trust in authority, in physicians, in manufacturers, in the newspapers that ran the advertisements, these things did not go away. They relocated. The 1940s and 1950s brought uranium glass and thorium-coated camera lenses and radioactive fertilizer and, briefly, a shoe store X-ray machine called the Pedoscope that allowed customers to see the bones of their feet when trying on shoes and which was installed in children's shoe stores across America and operated with essentially no safety precautions for approximately 2 decades before the evidence of its harm became sufficiently compelling to remove it. Think about that. A device that irradiated children's feet in shoe stores, operated by shoe salesmen with no radiation training, available to the public from the 1920s until the 1970s in some states. Not a secret, not illegal, not even particularly controversial, until it was. The pattern was the same pattern: new technology, incomplete evidence, commercial opportunity, consumer enthusiasm, authority endorsement, a gap between what was known and what was true, filled by products and advertisements and medical endorsements operating in good faith from incomplete information. And then, years later, the evidence. The distance between what we know and what is true is always the same distance. In every era, the specific content changes. The shape of the gap does not. The Radithor case, the Radium Girls case, the Pedoscope case, and the dozens of similar stories scattered across the 20th century share a structural feature that is worth naming explicitly because it connects them to each other and, if we are being honest, to us. The people who were harmed were not unusual. They were not uniquely credulous or unusually trusting or particularly susceptible to deception. They were people who did what people in their era were doing. They trusted the institutions that were supposed to protect them, purchased the products that those institutions endorsed, and paid the price for a gap in the available knowledge that was not their fault and was not, in most cases, something they had any way to detect. Eben Byers was not stupid. He was wrong. There is a difference, and the difference matters. The women who licked their brushes in the factory in Orange, New Jersey were not stupid either. They were workers doing a skilled job in a facility where the safety culture was non-existent, where the people who knew more than they did chose not to tell them, and where the information that would have changed their behavior was being actively managed by an employer whose financial interests lay in keeping them at their stations. They were not stupid. They were betrayed. There is a difference, and that difference is the reason their story is still told. What both groups share, what connects Eben Byers and Grace Fryer, and the millions of Americans who kept a Revigator on their kitchen counter and drank 2 glasses of radioactive water every morning, is the experience of living inside a gap between what is known and what is true. A gap that from the inside feels like knowledge, that feels like confidence, that feels like doing the right thing. It is only from the outside, from the vantage point of the subsequent decade, the subsequent evidence, the subsequent body, that the gap becomes visible. And by then, in most cases, it is already full. So here you are, at the end of an evening that began in a 1927 bathroom with a glowing bottle and ended somewhere in the space between what we know and what is true. You have met Eben Byers, who drank 1,400 bottles of Radithor because it made him feel wonderful, and who was wrong about what wonderful meant in that context. You have met the Radium girls, who licked their brushes because nobody told them they shouldn't, and who fought back against the people who knew and said nothing, and who won in court and died anyway. You have met William Bailey, who understood marketing, and the Revigator, which sat on 400,000 kitchen counters dispensing radioactive water to 400,000 families who had paid good money for it.
You have sat with the gap, the space between what the science of 1920 could demonstrate and what the bodies of the 1920s were experiencing. The space that commerce filled before caution could. The space that looks, from the inside, like confidence. The people who lived through this were not foolish.
They were people in their time, doing what made sense with the information available. And that, the doing of what makes sense with the information available, is both the most any person can do and, sometimes, not enough. They did what they could with what they had. Some of them paid for what they couldn't have known. Some of them had the knowing kept from them deliberately. And some of them, Grace Fryer, propped up in a wheelchair to attend a court proceeding, too ill to stand but present, testifying, made sure that at least some part of what happened was said out loud before they were gone. To understand the full shape of what happened with radium in America, you have to go back a little further, back to the moment when the science and the commerce first found each other, and the finding produced something that neither, separately, would have produced alone. Marie Curie did not intend to create a health product industry. She was a physicist. She was interested in the properties of radioactive elements, in understanding what they did and how they did it. She was not interested in selling things. But the discoveries she made with her husband Pierre in the late 1890s and early 1900s entered a world that was ready to sell them, and the selling happened with a speed and a thoroughness that the science itself could not keep pace with. The discovery of radioactivity as a phenomenon, the observation that certain elements emit radiation continuously and spontaneously, had been made by Henri Becquerel in 1896. The Curies built on this work, isolating polonium and radium from pitchblende ore in a process that took years of painstaking labor in a laboratory that was, by any modern standard, catastrophically unsafe. Marie Curie carried test tubes of radioactive isotopes in her coat pockets. She kept radioactive samples in her desk drawer. She described the faint glow of the radium preparations as beautiful, She did not know, could not have known, what the long-term consequences of this continuous exposure would be. She died in 1934 of aplastic anemia, a bone marrow condition caused by prolonged radiation exposure. Her personal notebooks from the 1890s are still radioactive. They are kept in lead-lined boxes at the Bibliothèque nationale de France. Researchers who wish to consult them must sign a waiver acknowledging the radiation risk and must wear protective equipment to handle them. The notebooks will remain radioactive for approximately 1,500 more years. This is the distance between the discovery and its full understanding. The woman who discovered radium died of it. The notebooks she wrote her discoveries in will outlast every institution on Earth in their current form. The substance she held in her coat pockets and admired for its beauty will still be emitting the radiation that killed her in the year 3500. Think about what that actually means in the context of 1920s America. The science was 20 years old. The discoverer was still alive. She would live until 1934. The full biological consequences of radiation exposure were not yet established. The gap between the discovery and its dangers was not deception, not fraud, not malice. It was the ordinary distance between the leading edge of knowledge and the lagging edge of consequence. The commercial industry that grew up around radium in America between 1910 and 1932 operated in this gap. The manufacturers were not all fraudsters, though some were, and William Bailey was certainly among them. Many of the physicians who recommended radium water to their patients were doing so in good faith, on the basis of the available evidence, which was genuinely ambiguous. The researchers who had published positive case studies from European spas were not fabricating data. They were observing real effects, the placebo effect, primarily, along with whatever genuine benefit the rest and the social setting of a spa provided, and attributing those effects to the radioactive mineral content of the water. The system was not corrupt. The system was incomplete. And in the space between incomplete and complete, commerce moved faster than caution. The Radium Dial Company in Ottawa, Illinois, was one of the factories where dial painters worked. Unlike the Radium Girls in New Jersey, whose case had begun to receive national attention by the mid-1920s, the women in Ottawa worked largely in obscurity for years. The company had, by some accounts, read about the New Jersey case and the litigation it had produced, and had made specific decisions about how to manage their workers' health complaints in light of that precedent. The women in Ottawa began experiencing symptoms in the mid-1920s. By the late 1920s, several were seriously ill. The company's response followed a pattern that was becoming, by this point, recognizable. Denial of any connection between their conditions and their work. Medical opinions solicited from physicians paid by the company. Claims that the women had other conditions unrelated to their employment. The implication, in some cases, that the women themselves were responsible for their illness through some personal failing or pre-existing condition. Catherine Wolfe Donahue, was one of the Ottawa dial painters. She had worked at the factory from 1922 and had developed the characteristic symptoms of radium poisoning by the late 1920s. By the time she was able to bring her case before an Illinois Industrial Commission in 1938, she was dying. She attended the hearing on a stretcher. She could not sit upright. She testified from a prone position. She won her case. She died 5 months later. The cases of the Radium Girls in New Jersey, in Illinois, in Connecticut produced a body of legal precedent that forms part of the foundation of American workplace safety law. The right of workers to know what they are being exposed to. The duty of employers to investigate and disclose hazards. The validity of medical testimony connecting workplace exposures to subsequent illness. None of these were established principles in 1920. They became established, in part, because a group of women who were dying chose to fight, in the only venues available to them, with the bodies they had left. The story of the Radium Girls is usually told as a story of corporate malfeasance, and it is that, and the malfeasance deserves to be named. But it is also a story about the consequences of the gap between what was known and what was true, the gap that the manufacturers had reason to suspect existed and chose not to investigate, the gap that the regulatory framework of the era was not equipped to close, the gap that the women themselves had no way of seeing from where they stood, at their tables, brushes in hand, producing objects that were beautiful and useful and sold all over the country. The watches sold. The dials glowed. The women who made the glow possible were sick and dying in cities that the watch buyers would never visit, and in conditions that the advertisements for the watches would never describe. This is not unusual. This is, in fact, the normal relationship between a consumer product and its supply chain, in any era. What is unusual about the Radium Girls story is not the concealment, but the visibility. The fact that the consequences were, eventually, too dramatic and too well documented and too publicly witnessed to remain in the supply chain where they belonged, from the manufacturer's perspective. The women made the harm impossible to ignore. Not by choice, in the first instance. The harm was happening to their bodies, regardless of whether they chose to make it visible. But the choice they made, the choice that Grace Fryer and Catherine Schaub and Catherine Donahue and the others made, was to refuse to let the harm be invisible. To show up in courtrooms and hearing rooms and newspaper offices with their deteriorating bodies and insist that what was happening to them be named. That insistence, in the historical record, looks like courage. From the inside, in the years when they were making it, it probably looked more like the only available option, which is usually what courage looks like from the inside. The Federal Trade Commission's action against William Bailey and Radithor in 1931 and 1932 was not the end of radium products in America. It was the beginning of the end of their most concentrated and most dangerous forms. Bailey himself continued to promote and sell various health products for years after Radithor was removed from the market. He died in 1949 of bladder cancer at the age of 64. Researchers examining his remains in 1949 found them still significantly radioactive, a consequence of the decades Bailey had spent handling and promoting and, presumably, sampling his own products. He had, it seems, believed in them, or believed in something, in the selling, in the story, in the version of science that the 1920s health product industry had constructed. Whatever he believed, it was housed in the same body that was accumulating the same radium that was accumulating in the bodies of his customers, and it did to him what it did to them. What remained, after the radium health product industry collapsed, was not an absence. Something took its place. It always does. The consumer psychology that had driven the radium market, the faith in technological progress, the willingness to believe that health could be purchased, the trust in the authoritative voice of medicine and science and advertising, did not disappear when the Revigator was taken off the shelves and Radithor was removed from the pharmacies. It found new products, new ingredients, new words for the old promises. The pattern persists. It persists because it is not a product of ignorance or stupidity, or even of corporate malice, though malice was present. It persists because it is a product of the gap, the ordinary, inevitable, always present gap between what is known and what is true. The gap that every era fills with its most confident available answer, which is never fully the right answer, and which the next era will assess with the benefit of evidence that the current era cannot yet access. We are always, all of us, living in the gap. The half-life of radium-226 is 1,600 years. The Radithor that Eben Byers drank in 1928 is still radioactive in his remains, in the cemetery in Pittsburgh where he was buried in 1932. The notebooks that Marie Curie wrote her discoveries in are still radioactive in their lead-lined boxes in Paris. The bodies of the Radium girls who died in the 1920s and 1930s have been exhumed and tested, and they are still radioactive, decades after the women who inhabited them died. Radium does not finish quickly. It finishes slowly, over centuries, over millennia, long past the point where the story of what happened has been forgotten by everyone who was present for it. The evidence persists longer than the memory. The consequence outlasts the cause. This is not a comforting thought exactly, but it is a precise one. And precision, at 2 in the morning, is its own kind of comfort. Let's go back to the morning. A specific morning. Let's say April 1928, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, because April is a month when people are thinking about their health, about the winter they have come through and the year stretching ahead. And Pittsburgh in 1928 is a city at the height of its industrial confidence, steel and iron and money, and the particular swagger of a place that knows it is essential. You wake up at 7. The bedroom is comfortable. You have done well, or someone in your household has, and the evidence of doing well surrounds you in the quality of the mattress and the weight of the drapes. You go to the bathroom. You have a routine in the bathroom, as everyone does, a sequence of small acts performed in approximately the same order every morning, because that is what a routine is, the removal of decision from the minor repeated actions of daily life. You open the medicine cabinet. There are the usual things, the shaving equipment, laid out in the correct order, the hair preparation, the tooth powder, and there, between the tooth powder and the aspirin, the Radithor. 2 bottles. You opened a fresh one yesterday, and the other still has a few doses left. You take the nearly empty bottle first, as you always do. You pour the measured dose into the small glass you keep beside the basin for this purpose. You drink it. It tastes like water, because it is water. Distilled water with radium in it, but the radium has no taste. The water has no taste. You set the glass down, replace the bottle, and continue with the rest of the morning routine. This takes perhaps 15 seconds. You have done this, with minor variations, every morning for more than a year. You will continue doing it for another 2 years, at which point the symptoms that are quietly accumulating in your bone tissue, the deterioration, the necrosis, the damage that the radiation is doing continuously and invisibly to the cells that line your skeleton, will become severe enough that you will stop. By then, the stopping will not be enough. But this morning, in April 1928, you feel well. Better than well. The Radithor is working, or seems to be, which in this context amounts to the same thing. Your arm, which had ached since the football game injury 18 months ago, feels better. Your energy is good. You are 50 years old and you feel, on a good morning, like a man in his late 30s. You go downstairs for breakfast. The newspaper on the breakfast table contains advertisements. This is 1928, and the advertisement is the primary vehicle through which the consumer economy communicates with the people participating in it. You read the advertisements the way you read everything, selectively, skeptically, with the practiced eye of a man who has spent decades in business and who knows what advertising is trying to do. But some advertisements are different from others. Some advertisements carry with them the authority of science, of medicine, of the institutions you trust, in the way you trust the newspaper itself, not naively, not without question, but with the baseline assumption that what appears in a serious publication has cleared some threshold of credibility before being printed. The advertisement for Radithor, if you encountered it, was not the advertisement of a patent medicine. It was not the florid language of the 19th century cure-all, the claims of miraculous transformation, the testimonials from happy customers who had been cured of consumption or hay fever or rheumatism. It was measured. It cited science. It referred to radium's established properties, its biological activity, its documented effects in European spa treatments, its role in the emerging field of radiation medicine that was, legitimately, producing results in the treatment of certain cancers. The radiation medicine was real. This is the important context that the Radithor story requires. The same years that saw the commercial radium health product industry flourish also saw the legitimate medical use of radiation develop rapidly. X-rays, discovered in 1895, had become standard medical diagnostic tools. Radium had been used to treat certain tumors since the early 1900s, and the results were genuine. Radiation could kill cancer cells, and in the hands of trained physicians using controlled doses, it was producing outcomes that nothing else in the medical toolkit could achieve. The consumer products borrowed this legitimacy without the controls. They took the vocabulary of radiation medicine, therapeutic doses, biological activity, cellular stimulation, and applied it to products whose doses were uncontrolled, whose mechanisms were untested in the relevant applications, and whose long-term effects were entirely unknown. The vocabulary was accurate. Its application to these products was not. This is a distinction that is harder to make from the inside of a decade than it is from the outside. The words were the same words. The white coat in the advertisement looked the same as the white coat in the physician's office. The scientific language read the same in the advertisement as it read in the medical journal. The gap between the legitimate science and its commercial misapplication was invisible in the places where most people encountered the products: the pharmacy, the newspaper, the physician's waiting room. The thorium toothpaste is worth a moment of your attention because it represents a particular kind of logic that recurs throughout the radium product era and that illuminates something about how the marketing of these products worked. Though Radium was a French cosmetic line introduced in 1933, after Radithor had been removed from the American market, but while the European radium cosmetic industry was still operating, that contained both thorium chloride and radium bromide in its face creams, soaps, and powders. The products were marketed on the premise that radiation, applied topically, would stimulate the skin cells, producing a more youthful and luminous complexion. The advertisements showed beautiful women with radiant skin. The word radiant in the advertising copy was doing double duty, glowing with health and literally emitting radiation, and the ambiguity appears to have been intentional.
The radium chocolate available in Germany in the 1920s, Radium Schokolade, sold as a health food with the recommendation that 1 piece per day would maintain the body's radioactive equilibrium, represents the same logic applied to food.
The radium suppositories, available by mail order in the United States in the 1920s, represented applied in a direction so uncomfortable to contemplate that it requires a specific act of imagination to understand how it was ever sold to anyone. But it was sold. All of it was sold, in significant quantities, to people who were not stupid, who were not desperate, who were not particularly more credulous than you are. People who trusted the institutions that were supposed to protect them, evaluated the available evidence as best they could, and made what seemed, at the time and with the information available, like a reasonable decision. The radium suppositories were called Vita Radium Suppositories, and they were marketed specifically to men who were experiencing what the advertising delicately referred to as lost manhood. The promise was that the radioactive material absorbed through the rectal tissue would restore the vital force and energy that age and stress had depleted. The advertisements cited the known biological effects of radiation at a cellular level and suggested, without any clinical evidence whatsoever, that these effects would translate into the specific outcomes the target customer most wanted. The market for these products was substantial. This is uncomfortable to sit with, but worth sitting with. Hundreds of thousands of Americans participated in the radium health product industry, not as passive victims of fraud, but as active consumers making choices in a marketplace that, by the standards of its time, appeared to offer legitimate options. The regulatory framework that would eventually establish the safety testing requirements we now consider standard did not yet exist in its current form. The institutional protections that we assume are present, that a product available in a pharmacy has been tested, that an ingredient listed on a label has been evaluated, that the doctor recommending something has access to independent safety data, were not reliably present in 1925. The consumer was, in important respects, on their own. Not because the society of 1920s America was indifferent to consumer protection. There was genuine concern, genuine advocacy, the work of people like Harvey Wiley, who had spent decades pushing for the food and drug regulations that culminated in the 1906 Act. But the framework was new and incomplete, and operating against a commercial environment that was fast and energetic, and operating with the complete confidence of an era that believed, sincerely, that more technology was always better. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 had been a genuine achievement. It had required that food and drug products be labeled accurately, that what was in the bottle be on the label.
It had prohibited the sale of adulterated products. It had given the government tools for enforcement that had not previously existed.
But it had not established a system for pre-market safety testing.
A
product could still be introduced to the market, sold widely, and investigated only after harm had been demonstrated, which meant after people had been harmed. The 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act passed in response to a different catastrophe, the sulfanilamide disaster of 1937, in which a pharmaceutical solvent killed more than 100 people, established the requirement that new drugs be tested for safety before approval. This was a significant advance. It was produced, like most regulatory advances in American consumer safety history, by a body count.
The Radium product era contributed to that body count. The Radium girls contributed to it. Eben Byers contributed to it. The hundreds of unnamed Americans who developed bone cancers and anemia and jaw necrosis from consuming products that glowed and felt, until they didn't, like excellent ideas, they contributed to it too.
The regulation did not prevent this. It arrived afterward, built on the evidence of what the absence of regulation had produced. This is the rhythm of American consumer safety history, repeated across a century of new technologies and new products, and new gaps between what is known and what is true.
Let's return to Eben Byers, because his story has an ending that deserves attention in its full detail, and because the ending contains something important about what it means to be wrong in a way that takes time to demonstrate. By 1930, Byers had lost 17 pounds. He was experiencing severe and worsening headaches. He was developing the jaw necrosis that would eventually require the surgical removal of most of his jaw. He had, by this point, drunk approximately 1,000 bottles of Radithor, and the radium they had contained was distributed throughout his skeleton, doing what radium in bone does, decaying continuously, emitting alpha particles at close range into the surrounding tissue, killing cells and damaging others, compromising bone structure from the inside with the patient. Relentless thoroughness of something that does not know it is doing harm and would not care if it did.
His physicians were baffled, initially. The constellation of symptoms he presented, the weight loss, the bone pain, the jaw deterioration, was unusual. It did not fit neatly into any established diagnostic category in 1930. Radium poisoning was not yet a well-characterized clinical entity.
The Radium girls' cases had established some of its features, but the medical literature on the subject was limited, and the connection to consumer products had not been widely disseminated in the journals that Byers' physicians were reading. The Wall Street Journal sent a reporter named William Lawrence to interview Byers in April 1931 at the sanitarium in New York where Byers had been receiving treatment. Lawrence's account of the visit is one of the most frequently cited documents in the history of the radium product era, because it captures, In the particular way that good journalism captures things, the human scale of what the epidemiological data could not convey. Byers had lost most of his jaw. His skull had, in places, been reduced in density to the point where the bone was described as having the consistency of shell. He had shrunk. The vigorous, athletic, larger-than-life figure that the society columns had described for 2 decades had been diminished, physically and visibly, to something that required the imagination to connect to the man he had been. He remained, according to Lawrence, mentally sharp. He knew what had happened to him. He knew what the Radithor had done. He spoke about it clearly, with the specific quality of a man who had arrived, past the point of denial or anger, at simple factual acknowledgement. He died the following year.
The Wall Street Journal headline, "The Radium water worked fine until his jaw fell off," became famous because it does what good headlines do. It contains the entire story in a sentence. The product worked. It worked fine, by the subjective report of the person taking it, right up until the point where the consequences of its working became impossible to ignore or survive.
The working and the harm were not separate events. They were simultaneous processes, one visible, one invisible, proceeding in the same body at the same time. This is the thing about the gap that makes it so persistent and so dangerous. From inside the gap, there is no gap. There is only the working, the energy, the feeling of restored vitality, the arm that no longer aches. The harm is occurring alongside these things but is invisible, occurring in the bone tissue, in the cellular level, in the register of the body that does not produce symptoms until it has been accumulating damage for long enough that the damage is extensive.
By the time the gap becomes visible, it is already full. Let's go into the factory, not as observers, as participants. Because the experience of the Radium girls is not fully available from the outside, and the outside is where this story has mostly been told.
You are 19 years old.
You are the daughter of immigrants, or the granddaughter, or you grew up in a neighborhood where your neighbors were. The year is 1921, and the job at the Radium dial factory pays more than most jobs available to a woman your age in the city of Orange, New Jersey. More than the textile work, more than domestic service, more than the counter jobs at the department stores on Main Street.
The work is skilled. You are proud of the skill. The factory floor is large and well lit. You sit at a long table with other women, some of whom you know from your neighborhood, some of whom you have come to know through the work. The table is covered with trays of clock and watch dials, small, precise objects that require steady hands and careful attention. In front of you, a small pot of the luminous paint, a fine sable brush, and the dial you are currently working on. The technique was explained to you when you started. The brush needs to be pointed for precision work. A loose brush produces fuzzy lines and imprecise numerals, and your work will be rejected. The most efficient way to maintain the point is to draw the brush tip through your lips after every few strokes. It takes perhaps a second. You do it without thinking, the way you swallow without thinking, the way your hands move through the routine of the work without requiring your conscious direction. Lip, point, dial, lip, point, dial. All day. The supervisors walk the floor. They check the quality of the work, the precision of the lines, the accuracy of the numerals, the consistency of the luminous coverage. They do not wear gloves when they handle the dials. They do not wear masks. Nobody in the factory wears protective equipment of any kind, because the protective equipment protocols for radium handling had not yet been developed, or had been developed and not disseminated to commercial facilities, or had been developed and disseminated and ignored because they would slow production. The paint smells of nothing much.
It tastes of nothing much. It is cream-colored in the pot, turning luminous green-white when exposed to light. It dries quickly, which is part of what makes the work satisfying. you can see immediately what you have produced. The dial sits in front of you, its numbers glowing faintly in the overhead light, and you can assess your work and find it good, and reach for the next one.
You go home at 5. Your uniform glows faintly in the dusk as you walk. Your hair, if you touched it during the day, which you did, adjusting it, pushing it back from your face, glows faintly where the paint transferred. Your friends find this charming. Your mother asks if it washes out. It washes out of the skin. It does not wash out of the bone. 2 years later, you notice something wrong with your teeth. A looseness in one of the back molars that shouldn't be there. You are 21. Your teeth should be secure and functional and entirely uninteresting. You mention it to the company nurse, who is not a physician and is employed by the company that is also your employer, and she tells you that it is nothing to be concerned about. Some women have tooth problems. It is not unusual. The molar is extracted, then another. The extraction sites do not heal cleanly. The tissue in the jaw is slow to close, slow to recover. Your dentist is not sure why. He has not encountered this before. By 1924, your jaw is aching constantly. The company physician examines you and tells you that you have a generally poor constitution. He suggests that your symptoms are psychosomatic.
He does not connect them to the factory, or does not say so, which in this context amounts to the same thing.
By 1925, several of the women you work with are experiencing similar symptoms. You talk about it in the way that workers talk about shared experiences. Quietly, at the edges of the shift, in the brief pauses that the work allows. The symptoms are the same symptoms. The jaw pain, the tooth loss, the bone aches that feel different from ordinary muscle soreness. You are not a physician, and you do not have the vocabulary to make the connection explicitly, but the pattern is present in your conversations even without the vocabulary.
Grace Fryer, who worked at the same facility, was one of the women who made the connection explicit. She had left the factory in 1920, and by 1922 was experiencing significant health problems, spine and jaw deterioration, pain that was severe and constant, and that her physicians could not adequately explain or treat.
She sought a physician willing to investigate the connection between her symptoms and her former work. Finding one took years. Most physicians either did not make the connection or, if they suspected it, were aware of the legal and professional complications that pursuing it might create.
The physician who eventually took the case was Harrison Martland, the medical examiner for Essex County, New Jersey, a man whose professional position gave him both the expertise and the institutional independence to investigate without the conflicts of interest that had made other physicians hesitant. Martland examined the women, documented their conditions, and concluded that their symptoms were consistent with radium poisoning. His 1925 paper in the Journal of the American Medical Association was the first significant medical documentation of the specific effects of internal radium deposition, the bone necrosis, the anemia, the characteristic distribution of damage that corresponded to the distribution of radium in the skeleton.
The paper was important. It established the connection in the medical literature. But medical literature moves at medical literature speed, which is slower than the speed at which the women's conditions were progressing, and slower than the speed at which the company's legal strategy was operating.
The company had retained physicians of its own. These physicians produced assessments that attributed the women's conditions to other causes. Syphilis was the most frequently cited alternative, because syphilis produced some overlapping symptoms and because the social stigma attached to it was severe enough to damage the women's credibility as witnesses.
The 1928 settlement, $10,000 each, a $600 annual pension, medical expenses covered, was modest by any standard. The women who negotiated it were dying. Their attorneys had pressed for the case to be settled before any of the plaintiffs died, because a plaintiff who died before the verdict was entered was, under New Jersey law at the time, unable to receive damages. The settlement was accepted, in part because the alternative was a trial that might extend beyond the life expectancy of the women bringing it. $10,000 and a $600 annual pension for a life destroyed, for a jaw removed, for a skeleton systematically consumed from the inside by a substance that will still be radioactive when every institution that judged the case has been replaced twice over. It was what the law could produce in 1928 in New Jersey for these women. They accepted it. The legacy of the Radium Girls case extends beyond the specific women who brought it. The legal precedent established in New Jersey and subsequently in Illinois, the right of workers to sue employers for occupational disease, the duty of employers to investigate workplace hazards, the validity of medical testimony connecting chronic exposure to subsequent illness, became part of the framework that American workplace safety law was built upon. The Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970, which established the framework for contemporary workplace safety regulation, rests on legal and moral foundations that the Radium Girls helped establish. The concept that a worker has a right to know what they are being exposed to, the hazard communication standards, the material safety data sheets, the right to know laws, these things did not exist in 1920. They were built, in part, on the evidence that their absence had produced. This is how the gap closes, not cleanly, not quickly, not without the cost of the bodies that fill it, but it closes. The evidence accumulates. The voices of the people who lived inside the gap eventually reached the people with the authority to change the conditions that produced it. The change comes late. It always comes late, but it comes. The question that the radium product era leaves behind, the question that makes it more than a historical curiosity, more than an entertaining story about people who drank glowing water, is the question of the gap, the question of what you cannot see from where you are standing. Every era has its radium. Every era has its category of thing that is understood by the standards of its time and the evidence of its time to be safe or beneficial or at least acceptable, and that a later era will assess with the benefit of evidence that the current era cannot access. This is not cynicism. It is the ordinary condition of living in time, which means living with incomplete knowledge, which means making decisions in the gap. The radium water drinkers of the 1920s were not different from us in the ways that matter. They were not more trusting, not more credulous, not more susceptible to advertising or to the authority of science and medicine. They were people in their time, doing what made sense with what they had, and the gap between what they had and what they needed was, as it turned out, large enough to be fatal for some of them. We are in our time. We have what we have. The gaps are present. They are always present, and they are, by definition, invisible from where we are standing. This is not a reason for paralysis. It is a reason for humility, and humility, at 2 in the morning, is its own kind of rest. Let's go deeper into the specific individuals who made the radium product era possible. Not the villains, not the victims, but the middle layer. The physicians, the pharmacists, the newspaper editors who ran the advertisements, the scientists who published the early positive case studies, the people who were not fraudsters and were not ignorant, and who participated anyway, in good faith, in a system that was producing harm they could not fully see. The physician who recommended Radithor to Eben Byers has a name in the historical record, C.C. Moyar, a doctor working out of the Hotel Alamac in New York City, the kind of physician who attended to the medical needs of wealthy residents and guests at fashionable addresses. Dr. Moyar did not prescribe Radithor maliciously. He prescribed it because it was on the market, because it had been sold to him and to the medical community as a legitimate therapeutic product, because his patient had a persistent complaint that was not responding to other treatments, and because the available evidence, The literature on European spa treatments, the preliminary studies, the testimonials of satisfied patients appeared to support its use.
He was wrong, but the wrongness was not personal failure. It was the wrongness of a man working in the gap, with the tools and knowledge the gap provided, making the best decision those tools allowed.
This is important to hold on to, because it changes the story.
The easy version of the Radithor story is, cynical manufacturer sells poison, greedy doctor recommends it, foolish rich man drinks it. Inevitable consequences follow. This version is satisfying because it locates the cause in human failing, in malice, greed, stupidity, and human failing is manageable. It can be addressed. It can be punished. It resolves into a lesson. The harder version is a gap in human knowledge, commercial and professional systems operating in good faith within that gap, harm produced not by anyone's worst impulses, but by the ordinary workings of a system nobody had yet built the tools to correct. This version is unsatisfying because it does not resolve. The lesson it teaches is not about avoiding bad actors. It is about the irreducible uncertainty of living in time.
Dr. Moyar continued practicing medicine after Byers died. There is no record of any professional sanction. He had done what physicians in his position were doing. The medical community had not yet built the consensus that would have allowed for a different judgment.
The pharmacists who stocked the Revigator and dispensed Radithor were working from the same incomplete information. Their professional obligation was to dispense what was legally prescribed. The legal prescription was the available standard of care. The available standard of care was built on the available evidence.
The available evidence was incomplete.
You can trace this chain of reasonable people making reasonable decisions, all the way from the mine where the radium ore was extracted to the bathroom shelf where the amber bottle sat. And at no point in the chain is there a moment where someone who understood the full picture made a choice to proceed anyway.
There are moments where people who had reasons to suspect suppressed those suspicions. The United States Radium Corporation management knew enough to be cautious and chose not to be. But even there, the choosing was made within a framework of incomplete knowledge. They knew more than they said. They did not know what the dial painters' bodies would show over decades about the precise mechanism and extent of the harm. The full picture was not available to anyone in 1920. It was assembled, slowly, from the bodies of the people who lived inside the gap. The assembling took approximately 15 years. The dial painters began getting sick around 1922. The first medical documentation of radium poisoning as a clinical entity was published in 1925. The first successful litigation was settled in 1928. The regulatory action against Radithor came in 1932. The establishment of radiation protection guidelines for the industrial use of radioactive materials followed in the mid-1930s. Each step required the previous step's evidence, and each step's evidence required time, years, sometimes decades, to accumulate. During those years, the harm continued. People continued buying and consuming and working with radium products while the scientific and legal and regulatory systems were catching up.
This is not a design flaw. This is the design. The systems we have for protecting people from new harms are responsive systems. They respond to evidence of harm. They cannot, by their nature, prevent the first iteration of harm. They can only recognize it when it occurs, document it, and adjust to prevent its recurrence.
This means that every new technology, every new product, every new substance introduced into commerce or medicine or the environment is, for a period of time, operating outside the protection of the systems designed to evaluate it. The length of that period varies. For radium, it was approximately a decade and a half.
For other technologies, it has been longer. Think about how many things you use every day that are in that period right now. not because they are harmful, they may not be, but because the evidence that would confirm or deny their long-term effects has not yet had time to accumulate. This is not a reason for paralysis. It is a reason for the specific kind of attention that distinguishes between the confidence that is warranted by the available evidence and the confidence that outruns it. The people who drank Radithor were confident. Their confidence was warranted by the available evidence. Their confidence was wrong. These three things were simultaneously true, and the simultaneity is the lesson. Let's talk about what happened to the other women. Not just Grace Fryer and the 4 who joined her lawsuit. There were others.
There were women who worked at the orange factory for years and developed symptoms and did not pursue legal action because they could not afford the lawyers, or because they were afraid of losing their jobs, or because the social machinery available to them did not include the option of suing a corporation and winning, or because they died before the option became available. Marguerite Carlo worked at the orange factory and developed symptoms in the early 1920s. She died in 1925, before the lawsuit was filed, before the settlement, before the national attention. She was 25 years old. Her death was attributed to a general decline in health.
The connection to her work was not established in her case, not because the connection was not there, but because the tools to establish it, the legal framework, the medical documentation, the institutional willingness to pursue it, were still being assembled. Irene Rudolph worked at the same factory and died in 1923 at the age of 24. Hazel Vincent died in 1922 at 24. Sarah Malifer died in 1928 at 35. In the middle of the national attention that the 5 plaintiffs were generating, her case simultaneous with the others but separate, her name not among the 5 that the newspapers were printing. These women are in the historical record, but not in the headlines. They are in the death certificates, and the factory employment records, and the church burial records, and the accounts that local historians have assembled from family testimony. They are the portion of the story that the story's own momentum, the lawsuit, the settlement, the Wall Street Journal headline, had a tendency to obscure. They mattered. They matter still. Not as evidence, though they are that, as people, as specific individuals who woke up in the morning and went to a job and came home at night and got sick and died, in circumstances that were not their fault and that they had limited ability to understand or resist. The work itself was genuinely skilled. This is something the accounts of the Radium girls often mention and something worth dwelling on, because it complicates the narrative in a useful direction. The dial painters were not unskilled laborers performing mindless, repetitive tasks. They were craftspeople.
The precision required to paint luminous numerals on a watch dial, numerals small enough to fit on a face the diameter of a quarter, readable in all lighting conditions, consistent from piece to piece, was real and trained and took time to develop. The women who were good at this work knew they were good at it.
They had the satisfaction of skilled workers who produce things of quality and know the difference between their work and inferior work. The dials they made were in the watches of soldiers and aviators and civilians across the country. They were useful objects, well made, the product of skill and concentration and steady hands. The skill made the harm harder to perceive and harder to leave. When you are good at something and the environment in which you exercise that skill is not obviously dangerous, when it looks clean and modern and well organized, when the supervisor compliments your precision, when the paycheck is better than the alternatives, the information that the skill is killing you has to overcome a very strong set of contrary indicators before it can be processed. By the time the contrary indicators were strong enough, by the time the jaw pain was undeniable, the tooth loss undeniable, the bone aches undeniable, the women had been at their tables for years. They were not fooled by the work. They were caught by it, in the way that people are caught by things that are genuinely good in most respects and harmful in one respect that is invisible for a long time. The factory itself was not a sinister place. This also bears saying. The photographs of the factory floor show a large, well-lit space with good natural light from the windows. By the standards of industrial workplaces in 1920, it was not a bad environment. The work was delicate and interesting. The women who worked there knew each other, sometimes for years.
They ate lunch together. Some of them were sisters, or cousins, or neighbors who had taken the job together. The harm was not in the environment that was visible. It was in the environment that was not. In the invisible particles emitted by the paint on the brush, and the paint in the pot, and the paint that transferred from the brush to the lips, to the jaw, to the bone. The visible environment was fine. The invisible environment was lethal. And the ability to see the invisible environment required knowledge that was not yet available to anyone on the factory floor. Now let's go forward a decade, because what happened after the radium product era officially ended is as important as what happened during it.
By 1935, the commercial radium health product industry in America was essentially finished. The Radithor case, the Radium Girls cases, the growing body of medical literature on radium poisoning, the FTC action, the FDA's increasing attention to therapeutic product claims. Together, these had created an environment in which selling radioactive water as a health drink was no longer commercially viable.
The product was gone, but radium was not gone. And the consumer psychology that had made the product successful was not gone. What happened in the late 1930s and 1940s was not a clean reckoning with the era of radioactive consumer products. It was a repositioning. Radioactive materials continued to be used in consumer products through the 1940s, 1950s, and beyond. The luminous dial industry continued to operate. The Second World War created enormous demand for luminous instruments, and the factories continued operating, now with somewhat better, though still inadequate, safety protocols. The lessons of the first generation of dial painters were learned, imperfectly, and applied with varying degrees of rigor. The Pedoscope, the shoe-fitting fluoroscope, expanded through the 1940s and into the 1950s, reaching its peak of installation somewhere around 1950, when approximately 10,000 of the machines were in use in shoe stores across the United States. The Pedoscope allowed a customer to stand on a platform, insert their feet into a slot, and look through a viewer at a fluoroscopic image of the bones of their feet inside the shoes being fitted. The image was green and slightly blurry, and showed the metatarsals and phalanges floating inside the shoe's outline, and children in particular found it remarkable. A machine that let you see your own bones, in a shoe store, on a Saturday afternoon. The radiation dose delivered to each viewing was not large by the standards of medical fluoroscopy, but the machines were operated without the safety controls that would have been standard in a medical facility. There was no lead shielding to protect the rest of the body. There was no dosimetry to measure cumulative exposure. The salesperson operating the machine had no training in radiation safety and no reason to limit viewing time, since longer viewings produced more engaged customers. A child who went shoe shopping with their parents 3 or 4 times a year at stores with a Pedoscope received radiation to their feet at each visit. Cumulatively, over years of childhood, this was not a trivial exposure.
The evidence of harm was slow to accumulate. Shoe shopping fluoroscopy does not produce the acute and dramatic symptoms that consuming 36 micrograms of radium per month produced in Eben Byers. It produces, at most, an increased risk of cancer in the irradiated tissue, expressed as a statistical signal in a population study, years or decades after the exposure.
Statistical signals in population studies do not produce Wall Street Journal headlines. They produce papers in epidemiology journals, read by researchers who read epidemiology journals, eventually producing regulatory guidance that eventually reaches the shoe stores. Eventually. Ohio banned the Pedoscope in 1950, Pennsylvania in 1954. The FDA issued guidance against them in 1957. Some states had pedoscopes in use until the late 1960s. The last ones were removed in the early 1970s, approximately 50 years after the first commercial radium health products appeared on American pharmacy shelves.
50 years. 2 generations of children whose feet were irradiated in shoe stores by machines that were, by the standards of their time, and within the regulatory environment of their time, legal, normal, and unremarkable. The gap was 50 years wide, in this instance,
Filled, as gaps are filled, with the ordinary actions of ordinary people in an ordinary world. Children trying on shoes, parents watching, salespeople helping, manufacturers selling, regulators managing an ever-expanding landscape of new technologies with the tools they had at the time. No malice required. No ignorance required, just the gap. The uranium glass that was fashionable in the 1930s and 1940s. The pale green or yellow tableware that glowed under ultraviolet light and was sold in department stores as a modern, attractive alternative to ordinary glassware, represented another iteration of the same pattern. Uranium oxide was added to glass to produce the characteristic color and fluorescence. The glass was mildly radioactive. It sat on tables and was handled daily and was used for food and drink. The radiation exposure from ordinary use was, by contemporary assessment, low. Not dangerous in the doses delivered by typical household use. But it was not zero, and it was not labeled. And the people who bought it did not know it was radioactive, because in the 1930s and 1940s, radioactive glass was simply glass that was green and pretty and modern. The thorium-coated camera lenses available from the 1940s through the 1970s, used by serious photographers who valued their optical qualities, which were genuine, irradiated the hands of photographers who handled them at low levels over years of use. The thorium gas mantle used in camping lanterns, which produced a bright, clean light and was commercially available through most of the 20th century, emitted radioactive thorium dioxide particles when burned. People who used these lanterns regularly breathed those particles. The exposure was low. The risk was small but not zero. The users did not know.
In each case, a product with genuine utility, incorporating a radioactive material for reasons that were functional rather than health-promoting. Available to consumers without information about the radioactive component, used in ordinary ways by ordinary people who trusted that what was on the shelf had been adequately evaluated. In each case, the gap.
The question of what fills the gap now, what products and substances and technologies we are currently using in good faith, within the limits of available evidence, that a later era will assess with the benefit of evidence we cannot yet access, is a question that cannot be answered. That is the nature of the gap. You cannot see it from inside it, but you can recognize its shape. You can recognize the structure, new technology, enthusiasm, commercial deployment, incomplete evidence, confidence that outruns the evidence, and somewhere downstream, bodies. The structure is consistent across the century. The specific content changes. The shape does not. This is not a counsel of despair. Knowledge advances. The gaps close, imperfectly and at cost, but they close. The radium gap closed. The asbestos gap is closing. The lead paint gap closed. The tobacco gap closed, over decades, against enormous resistance. Each closing was incomplete and late, and bought with the health of the people who lived inside the gap before the closing came. But the closings are real. The knowledge is real. The regulatory frameworks that were built, often clumsily and always too slowly, on the evidence of what the absence of regulation produced. Those frameworks are real, and they work, imperfectly and in aggregate, better than nothing. Better than the pharmacies of 1925, where the Revigator sat on the shelf next to the aspirin and the tooth powder and required no testing and carried no warning and told you nothing except that it was modern and scientific and good for your health. We know more now. Not everything. Not enough, certainly, for the people who will be harmed by the gaps we cannot yet see. But more. More than the man in the 1927 Pittsburgh bathroom with the glowing bottle in his hand. More than the 19-year-old woman at the dial painting table with the brush in her hand and the paint on her lips. The knowing costs something. It always costs something. Let's go back to the factory one more time. Not to the main floor where the dial painters worked, but to the room that the United States Radium Corporation management used for their own meals and meetings. The room that, by some accounts, was equipped differently from the production floor in ways that suggested someone, somewhere in the organization, knew something that the workers did not. The management did not use lip-pointing. The management, when handling radium materials, used caution that was not extended to the workers. This distinction between what the people who knew the most about radium did in their own practice and what they instructed their workers to do is the sharpest evidence that the harm was not simply a product of ignorance. Some of it was a product of a decision about whose ignorance to maintain.
This is where the story of the Radium Girls intersects with a much older story about whose health counts and whose risk is acceptable and who gets to decide.
The dial painters were young women, working class, many of them immigrant or first-generation American. The corporate managers who employed them were men with capital and connections and legal teams. The physicians who initially denied the connection between the women's illnesses and their work were credentialed professionals operating within a system that gave their assessments weight that the women's own testimony could not match. The women had to fight for the right to have what was happening to their bodies recognized as real, caused by their work, and actionable in law. This was not a simple fight. It was a fight against credentialed dismissal, against physicians who said the symptoms were psychosomatic, against company lawyers who introduced alternative diagnoses, against a legal system that was structured in ways that made corporate liability for occupational disease hard to establish and easy to delay. The fact that they won, imperfectly, partially, too late for some of them, was not inevitable. It was the result of specific choices made by specific people who decided that the available response to what was happening to them was insufficient and pursued other responses in the only venues that were open.
Grace Fryer could not find an attorney willing to take her case for 2 years after she began looking. The legal risk was high, and the precedent was uncertain, and the corporate defendant had resources that the plaintiffs did not.
When she finally found Raymond Berry, an attorney willing to take the case, he did so understanding that the case was difficult and the outcome uncertain. The 5 women who eventually filed, Grace Fryer, Edna Hussman, Catherine Schaub, Quinta McDonald, and Albina Larice, were not a random selection of the affected workers.
They were the ones who were well enough to pursue legal action, willing to face the public attention and the corporate opposition, connected enough to find legal representation, and determined enough to persist through years of procedural delay. Behind them were other women who met none of those conditions, or only some of them. The women who were too sick to attend court.
The women who needed their jobs and could not risk being seen as troublemakers. The women who had already died. The women who didn't know the case was happening. The women who knew and decided the cost was too high. The 5 who filed were the visible edge of a much larger population of harm. The settlement they reached was a legal outcome for 5 people. The precedent it set was for everyone who would come after them in similar circumstances, which turned out to be a very large number of people over a very long time. This is how precedent works. The people who establish it usually do so in circumstances that are painful and particular and specific to their own lives and bodies. The benefits flow outward from that specificity, in ways that the people establishing the precedent rarely live to see in their full extent. Catherine Schaub died in 1933, 5 years after the settlement. Grace Fryer died in 1933 as well. Quinta MacDonald died in 1929. Albina Larice survived until 1946. Edna Hussman died in 1939. The legal principles they established are in American workplace safety law today. The organizations that were built in response to their cases, the occupational health research institutions, the radiation protection standards bodies, the regulatory agencies with expanded authority over industrial hazards, are still operating. The people who built those organizations are mostly gone too. The work continues. Now let's follow the radium itself, the specific isotopes that Eben Byers drank, that the dial painters ingested, through time, because the story of where radium goes after the human story ends is its own kind of history. Then Eben Byers was exhumed in 1965, 33 years after his death. His remains were still significantly radioactive. The radium-226 and radium-228 that he had consumed in 1,400 bottles of Radithor were still present in his bones, still decaying, still emitting radiation into the soil around him. The half-life of radium-226 is 1,600 years. The half-life of radium-228 is approximately 5 years, producing a decay chain that includes several other radioactive isotopes before reaching a stable endpoint. The radium Byers drank in 1928 will be in his remains, in measurable quantities, in the year 3500. In some form, it will be there in the year 32,000. This is the aspect of the radium story that resists the narrative closure that other historical stories allow. Most stories end, the harm stops, or the injustice is addressed, or the people involved die and the story passes into the past tense. The radium story does not fully end. The material is still there, in the bones of the people who consumed it, in the soil around those bones, in the factory sites where it was processed, in the slag heaps from the uranium mines that supplied it. The watch factories where the radium girls worked have been remediated, in most cases, the contaminated soil removed, the buildings demolished or decontaminated, the sites cleared for redevelopment. The remediation was expensive and incomplete, and revealed, in the process of occurring, how thoroughly the radioactive material had spread through the factory sites over decades of operation. Contamination was found in the surrounding soil, in the basements of nearby buildings, in the groundwater in some areas. The cleanup cost far more than the settlements paid to the workers. This is usually the arithmetic of industrial contamination. The cost of addressing the harm, when it is finally addressed, vastly exceeds the cost that would have been required to prevent it. The prevention requires the knowledge that the harm is occurring, which requires the time it takes to accumulate. By the time the knowledge is complete, the cost of the prevention is irrelevant. What remains is the cost of the response. This arithmetic has not changed. It is still the arithmetic that governs the relationship between industrial activity and the environments in which it occurs. The numbers change, the structure does not. Let's return, one final time, to the individual scale, to the bathroom shelf, to the amber bottle, to the man who reached for it in the morning, with the complete, sincere, evidence-supported confidence that he was doing something good for himself. Eben Byers was described by his contemporaries as a man who believed in things. He believed in physical vitality. He believed in the power of effort and discipline, and the right inputs to produce the outcomes he wanted. He was a competitive athlete who had won a national championship, and the psychology of competitive athletics, the faith that the right training regimen, the right diet, the right practice routine would produce measurable results, was deeply embedded in how he understood his own body and its maintenance. Radithor fit this psychology perfectly. It was a specific, measurable intervention. You took it daily, in defined doses, and you monitored your response. The response was positive. The arm felt better, the energy improved, the physical confidence was restored. This was, for a man who understood his body as a performance system that responded to inputs, entirely legible. The drug worked.
You increased the dose!
The response to Radithor that Byers experienced, the improvement in his arm, the increased energy, the sense of restored vitality, was real in the sense that he felt it. Whether it was pharmacologically produced by the radium, or whether it was placebo effect, or whether it was the result of other changes he made concurrently, is not entirely clear from the historical record. What is clear is that for 3 years, he felt that the product was working, and the feeling was consistent and reliable enough that he recommended it to friends and sent them cases of it. His endorsement was sincere. This is important. He was not a paid spokesman. He was not performing enthusiasm for commercial purposes. He was a satisfied customer who genuinely believed in the product and wanted people he liked to benefit from it the way he had. The harm he did, directing his friends and associates toward a product that was killing them, he did from the best intentions, on the basis of the best available evidence as he understood it, in a spirit of generosity. The intentions do not change the harm, but they change what the story is about. It is not about selfishness or cynicism or the betrayal of trust. It is about the profound unreliability of the felt sense of benefit as evidence of actual benefit, when the thing that is harming you takes years to produce symptoms that can be connected to the harm. The radium was working on Byers every morning from 1927. It worked through 1928 when he felt wonderful. It worked through 1929 when he was still energetic and recommending the product to his friends. It worked through early 1930 when he began losing weight and experiencing headaches that he attributed to other causes. The working was constant and invisible, and proceeding on its own timeline, indifferent to his felt sense of benefit. By the time the working became undeniable, 3 years of radium had accumulated in his skeleton. The 3 years of felt benefit and the 3 years of accumulating damage had been happening simultaneously, in the same body, on the same days, and from the inside, only one of them was visible. This is what it is to live inside the gap. You cannot feel the gap from inside it. You can only feel what you feel. The arm that no longer aches, the energy that has returned, the sense that the intervention is doing what it promised. The gap proceeds on its own timeline, in the register of the body that does not produce symptoms until the accumulation is sufficient, indifferent to your experience of it. The question of how to navigate this, how to act reasonably in the face of the inevitable incompleteness of what is known, does not have a clean answer. Paralysis is not the answer. You cannot decline to participate in the world on the grounds that some of what the world offers will turn out to be harmful. You can only participate with the information you have. Maintain a particular kind of attention to the distinction between confidence that is warranted by evidence and confidence that outruns it, and accept that this attention will not protect you completely. It will not protect you completely because the gap is structural. It is built into the relationship between time and knowledge. The evidence of harm always comes after the harm has begun. The protection always comes after the evidence. The knowledge always costs something before it protects anything. This is the condition of being human in time. The people who drank the radium water did not fail to be human in time. They were exactly that, human, in time, doing what made sense with what they had. What they had was not enough. What we have is more than what they had, and less than what will eventually be known, and we are navigating the gap between those two states as they did, with what we have in our time. Let's visit one more place before we close this evening. A place that is not a factory, and not a courtroom, and not a bathroom shelf, but that connects all of those places in a way worth seeing before you sleep. The Curie Institute in Paris maintains, among its archival holdings, a collection of Marie Curie's personal effects that were transferred to permanent storage in the 1980s, decades after her death. The collection includes her notebooks, her personal diaries, her clothing, her furniture, and the laboratory equipment she used in the years when she was isolating radium and polonium from pitchblende ore. These objects are housed in lead-lined boxes. Researchers who wish to access them must schedule appointments, sign waivers acknowledging the radiation risk, and wear dosimetry equipment to measure their exposure during the visit. The clothing cannot be handled without protective gloves. The notebooks cannot be read without shielding. The personal effects of the woman who discovered radium are, themselves, among the most persistently radioactive objects in France. This is not an irony that exists to be mined for meaning. It is simply a fact about what radium does and how long it does it. Marie Curie died in 1934. Her notebooks are still radioactive. They will be radioactive in 2500.
They will be radioactive in 3500. The evidence of her work, the literal physical evidence, encoded in the isotopes that transferred from her experiments to the pages where she recorded them, will outlast every institution and almost every object currently in existence on the surface of the planet. The notebooks are beautiful, in photographs.
They are written in her hand, in French and Polish, dense with calculations and observations and the specific language of a scientist recording results as they occur. They show the mind at work, the patient, systematic mind of someone doing something genuinely difficult, for the first time, in conditions that were inadequate and in a professional environment that was often hostile, producing results that changed what humanity understood about the nature of matter.
They are also, in the most literal physical sense, dangerous. To hold them is to be irradiated. To read them without protection is to receive a dose that, accumulated over enough reading sessions, would produce measurable harm. The beauty and the danger are not separate. They are in the same pages, in the same ink, inseparable. This seems, at 2 in the morning, like something worth sitting with. The most important scientific notebooks of the 20th century cannot be read without protective equipment. The work they document changed the world in ways that took decades to fully unfold. In medicine, in physics, in energy, in weapons, in the regulatory frameworks built to manage a substance whose properties were not understood until they had been demonstrated in enough bodies that the demonstration was impossible to deny.
Marie Curie did not know what she was creating when she created it. She knew what she had found. An element with extraordinary properties, a substance that glowed and produced heat, and appeared to violate the conservation laws as they were then understood.
She did not know that the finding would produce watch dials painted with the substance in factories in New Jersey and Illinois, and that the women painting those dials would ingest it and become sick and have to fight in court to have their illness recognized. She did not know that a man in Pittsburgh would drink it in quantities that would reduce his skull to half its original density. She did not know that ceramic crocks would sit on 400,000 American kitchen counters, dispensing it in measured doses to families who considered themselves health-conscious and modern. She could not have known. The knowledge that would have told her these things did not exist when she was doing the work that made them possible. She was in the gap, doing what the gap allowed, which was extraordinary, which was transformative, which produced consequences she could not foresee, and which she paid for with her life. The notebooks in their lead-lined boxes are a kind of monument, not to her genius, which is documented everywhere else, but to the gap itself, to the irreducible distance between what is discovered and what is understood, to the time it takes for knowledge to become knowledge, to move from the observation at the laboratory bench to the clinical study to the regulatory guidance to the protection that eventually arrives, always late, always at cost, for the people who needed it earlier. The gap is in the lead-lined boxes. The gap is in Eben Byers' remains in Pittsburgh. The gap is in the factory site in Orange, New Jersey, where the remediation is still not fully complete. The gap is in the medical records of the women who worked at the factory and got sick, and fought, and died, and left behind precedents that protect people who will never know their names.
The gap is in every era, in every technology, in every product currently on the shelf of whatever pharmacy or health store or online marketplace is operating in your time. Not because what is on the shelf is harmful, it may not be, but because the knowledge that would confirm or deny that has not yet had time to accumulate. The accumulation takes time. Time requires people to be living inside the gap while the accumulation occurs. This is the condition. It has not changed. It will not change, because it is structural, built into the relationship between the speed of innovation and the speed of evidence, which are not the same speed and have never been the same speed and have no mechanism by which they would become the same speed. You are, right now, in your bed, in whatever year this is for you, inside the gap in some dimension that you cannot currently identify. Not because someone is hiding it from you, though that is sometimes true, but because the evidence is not yet complete. The accumulation is ongoing. The knowledge is on its way. It will arrive. It always arrives. Sometimes it arrives in time to prevent the harm. Sometimes it arrives after. The ratio of those outcomes has been improving, slowly, over the century that the Radium girls helped initiate. The protections are better. The testing requirements are more comprehensive. The institutional memory of what happens when confidence outruns evidence is encoded in regulations and guidelines and professional standards that were built on the cases of people who had to demonstrate the harm with their own bodies. The demonstration was costly. The knowledge it produced was real. Both of those things are true, and the truth of both of them together is what the century of radium, from Marie Curie's laboratory in 1898 to the remediation of the factory sites in the 1980s and 1990s, ultimately means. The gap closes, slowly, at cost, with the evidence that can only be produced by living inside it. You are living inside it. So is everyone else who is alive right now. In most respects, in most dimensions, the gap is small, and the risk is low, and the available protection is adequate. In some respects, in some dimensions, it is not yet known whether the gap is small, and the risk is low, and the protection is adequate. This is not a comfortable thought to take to sleep, but it is an honest one, and honesty, at this hour, is its own kind of rest. The Revigator sat on the kitchen counter and dispensed its water every morning, and the family drank it with the complete confidence of people who had done their due diligence, who had read the literature that was available, who had consulted the physicians who were available, who had made the decision that the available information supported. The information was incomplete. The gap was there. The family did not know. They drank the water. It was a Tuesday morning in 1924, and the water came from the Revigator, and outside the kitchen window the suburb was beginning its day, the milk truck making its early rounds, the children appearing at doors with their school things. The particular quality of a weekday morning in a decade that believed in progress, and had reasons to believe in progress, and was, in some respects and not others, right to believe in it. The morning was ordinary. The water was ordinary. The gap was invisible, as gaps are, from the inside. It was enough for that morning. It was all that was available. Let's stay in the 1950s for a moment, because the 1950s represent something particular in the arc of the radium story. A decade when the cultural understanding of radiation was undergoing a dramatic shift, when the mushroom cloud had made radioactivity visible and frightening in a way the health product era never had, and yet when radioactive consumer products were still circulating with remarkable casualness through the domestic spaces of American life. The contradiction is worth sitting with. The same decade that produced civil defense drills and backyard fallout shelters and the specific civilian anxiety of the Cold War nuclear imagination also produced uranium glass on dinner tables,
shoe-fitting fluoroscopes in children's shoe stores, and thorium-coated camera lenses in the hands of serious amateur photographers.
The feared radiation and the casual radiation were not, for most Americans in 1955, the same radiation. The bomb was terrifying. The shoe store machine was a novelty. The green glass on the dining table was pretty. This split in the cultural understanding of radiation, between the dramatic and the mundane, between the military and the domestic, between the feared and the merely present, allowed the casual radiation of consumer products to persist well into the decade that should, by any logic, have been most attuned to radiation's dangers.
You are 7 years old. It is 1953, and you are in a shoe store with your mother, who is trying to fit you for school shoes before September. The store has one of the machines, a large wooden cabinet, waist-high, with 2 viewing ports on top and a slot at the bottom where you put your feet. The salesman, a pleasant man in a tie who smells of aftershave and speaks with the particular cheerful authority of someone who does this all day, invites you to step onto the platform and put your feet in the slot. You put your feet in. You look through the viewer.
And there, in the green-tinged underworld of the fluoroscopic image, you can see the bones of your feet inside the shoe, the small phalanges of your toes, the metatarsals, the shadow of the leather upper surrounding all of it. It is one of the most remarkable things you have ever seen.
You are seeing your own skeleton in a shoe store on a Tuesday afternoon in September 1953. The salesman looks through the other viewer and nods and says something about the fit. Your mother looks through her viewer and nods too.
You stay on the platform for a while because you cannot stop looking at the bones of your feet. The machine is emitting X-rays at levels that vary considerably from machine to machine. There were no standardized specifications, no regular calibration requirements, no mandatory shielding outside the primary beam.
Some machines, when tested in the 1950s and early 1960s by the first radiation safety surveys, were found to be delivering doses to the feet that were multiple times higher than the occupational exposure limits for radiation workers. You were a child. You were not a radiation worker. There were no dose limits that applied to you in 1953. Your mother takes you to this store, or a store like it, 3 times over the course of your childhood, maybe 4 times. Each time there is a machine, and you look through the viewer and see your bones and find it remarkable. The remarkableness fades over time. By the 3rd visit, it is simply part of what happens when you get new shoes. Familiar, unremarkable, routine.
The cumulative dose to your feet from those visits is not 0. It is not large by the standards of any dose that would produce acute symptoms. It is a small increment in a lifetime's background radiation exposure, delivered specifically to the feet of a child by a recreational device in a commercial setting, without consent and without information. The state of Ohio moved first, in 1950, to regulate or ban the devices. The timing is notable. 1950, 5 years before radiation safety concerns would become widely visible in the general public through the civil defense and nuclear anxiety discourse of the mid-1950s. Ohio moved because a radiation physicist in the state health department had looked at the machines and calculated the doses and understood, from his professional knowledge, that the doses were inconsistent with any responsible use of ionizing radiation in a non-medical setting. His concern was professional. It was based on knowledge that was not yet widely disseminated. He moved within the available institutional channels, the state health department, the regulatory process, and produced a regulation that applied within Ohio's borders. Other states moved more slowly.
The federal government moved more slowly still. The FDA's national guidance came in 1957, 7 years after Ohio, and after 30 years of the machines being in use. Some states had the machines until the late 1960s. The last documented use of a shoe-fitting fluoroscope in the United States was in 1981. 1981. 57 years after the first commercial radium health products appeared on American pharmacy shelves. The specific technology had changed. The structure had not. There is a particular quality to the way the shoe-fitting fluoroscope era ended that is worth noting. It did not end with a scandal.
It did not end with a prominent case of a child who developed cancer in their feet and whose case became nationally known and drove regulatory action. It ended slowly, state by state, as individual radiation safety officials looked at the machines and calculated the doses and concluded that the doses were not consistent with responsible practice.
The guidance accumulated. The regulations followed. The machines were eventually removed, not because the harm was dramatic, but because the professional consensus against them became too clear to ignore. This is a different kind of gap closing than the Radium girls provided. The Radium girls provided visible, dramatic, documented, personally embodied evidence of harm that made the harm impossible to deny.
The shoe store fluoroscope ended through the quieter mechanism of professional consensus, through the gradual convergence of expert opinion that the risk was real and the benefit insufficient to justify it. Both mechanisms are part of how gaps close. Sometimes the evidence arrives dramatically, in the form of bodies that insist on being seen.
Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the form of calculations and professional consensus that never produce a newspaper headline but accumulate into regulatory change. The quiet mechanism is, in some respects, the better mechanism. It produces the change without requiring people to be harmed first. In practice, it is also slower.
The professional consensus against the shoe-fitting fluoroscope took decades to develop and decades more to translate into universal regulation. During those decades, the machines operated. The ideal would be a mechanism that produced the change before the harm, that anticipated the gap rather than responding to it.
This mechanism does not exist, and its non-existence is not a failure of will or attention. It is a consequence of the fundamental fact that you cannot know the long-term effects of something before the long term has elapsed. Pre-market safety testing, which the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act required for new drugs, was an attempt to build this mechanism.
It moved the testing before the commercial deployment. It did not eliminate the gap. It narrowed it. The gap between initial deployment and full knowledge of long-term effects remained, but the most acute and immediate risks were now identified before the product reached consumers. This was an improvement.
It was not a solution. Solutions to the gap problem do not exist. Improvements to the gap problem are available and have been accumulated, slowly and at cost, over the century since the first Revigator was filled with tap water and left to sit overnight on a kitchen counter in 1912. Each improvement cost something. The cost was paid, in most cases, by the people who lived inside the gap before the improvement arrived. They are the ones whose names are in the legal cases, whose bodies are in the historical record, whose insistence on being seen and heard and compensated produced the evidence that built the frameworks that protect the people who came after them. The debt is real. It is owed to people whose names most of us will never know, who did not choose to be evidence and did not choose to be the cost of the knowledge that protects us, but who became both of those things, and who are, in the most direct and specific sense, the reason the pharmacy shelf looks the way it does now rather than the way it looked in 1925. The debt is paid in the particular currency of history, which is not money and is not recognition and is not comfort, but is the continuation of the work, the ongoing, imperfect, always incomplete project of building the knowledge that the next gap will require. The women who painted the dials in Orange, New Jersey, between 1917 and 1926, did not set out to build that knowledge. They set out to do their job and collect their pay and go home to their families. The knowledge they produced was a byproduct of what was done to them, extracted from their bodies by researchers and physicians and attorneys and journalists who recognized, in the specific pattern of their illness, something that needed to be named and documented and litigated into visibility. The extraction was not gentle, but the knowledge is real. It is in the exposure limits for radiation workers, which are based substantially on the dose-response relationships established by studying the dial painters' cases. It is in the requirements for industrial hygiene monitoring in workplaces where radioactive materials are handled.
It is in the legal framework that allows workers to sue employers for occupational disease. It is in the professional ethics that require physicians to investigate rather than dismiss unexplained clusters of illness in working populations. None of this is complete. None of it is sufficient for every situation that will arise. The gaps continue to exist and to require filling, but the knowledge that fills them is, in part, the knowledge that the Radium girls produced, not by choice, not with enthusiasm, but with their bodies and their insistence, and the slow, costly, imperfect mechanism by which the gap closes.
The Revigator that sat on the kitchen counter in 1924 is in a landfill somewhere, or in the soil where it was buried, or in a museum collection if it survived intact. The radioactive material in its ceramic lining has been decaying since 1924, along the chain of isotopes that uranium-bearing minerals produce as they approach their stable endpoints. It will continue decaying for centuries. The water that passed through that lining, on all the mornings of all the years it was in use, was drunk by a family who considered themselves fortunate to have it. The family is gone. The knowledge of what was in the water took time to arrive, and arrived after the Revigator was already on the shelf of history rather than the shelf of the kitchen. But it arrived. So here you are. At the end of an evening that began in a 1927 Pittsburgh bathroom with a bottle of something that glowed, and moved through the factory floors of Orange, New Jersey, and the courtrooms where women too ill to stand gave their testimony from stretchers, and arrived here, in the ordinary dark of wherever you are, with water that requires nothing of the ceramic crock beside it, and comes from a tap and contains exactly what it is supposed to contain.
You have spent the evening with the gap, the space between what was known and what was true, the space that Eben Byers inhabited for 3 years, feeling wonderful, the space that Grace Fryer inhabited at her work table, brush in hand, lip to bristle, until the space became impossible to deny.
You have met William Bailey, who understood marketing better than chemistry and died of the same thing he sold. You have met Marie Curie, who carried radium in her coat pocket and found it beautiful, and who was not wrong about that, and who was also paying a price that would not be fully understood until after she paid it.
You have met the 400,000 households who kept a Revigator on their kitchen counter and considered themselves health-conscious and forward-thinking and thoroughly modern. They were all of those things. They were also inside the gap. The women who painted the dials, the ones who fought, who showed up in courtrooms with deteriorating jaws and went on fighting, who won settlements that were modest and inadequate and were nonetheless the beginning of something. Those women are worth sitting with for a moment before you sleep.
They did not have the information they needed. They were not given the information they needed by the people who had it and chose not to share it. And they went to work anyway, because work was what was available and available was what they had.
And when the harm became undeniable, they named it in the only venues available to them, with the only evidence available to them, their own bodies, their own symptoms, their own insistence that what was happening to them was connected to where they had worked and what they had been told. Their insistence was right. Their insistence cost them, and it changed something, and both of those things are true simultaneously, which is usually how change works. Sleep well. The Revigator is empty. The shelves in the pharmacy are stocked with things that have been tested, imperfectly but genuinely, by people whose job it is to ask whether the product will harm the person taking it.
The water comes from a tap. The night is dark and ordinary and requires nothing of you. You are safe in your bed. The gap is there, somewhere. It is always there. But for now, in this quiet, in this dark, you are on the right side of what is known. That is enough. Rest.